Hi everyone, I'm Rita Cacas, and we're in a little meeting today to discuss Filipino American History Month here in the Washington, D.C. area. With me here are Genevieve Villamora and Ben Guzman. Let's just kind of welcome them and they'll talk a little bit about themselves.
Great, hi. Happy Filipino American History Month. October is a great time of year. So I appreciate having this conversation with both of you. I'm really excited actually to talk to you about Filipino American History Month. Again, my name is Ben Guzman, and I serve as the director for the Mayor's Office on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs here. So yeah, I've been in the district for about 20 years and continue to discover new things about it, particularly about the Filipino community here. So I'm excited to have this conversation, so thank you.
My name is Genevieve Villamora, and I am one of the co-owners of a small Filipino restaurant in Columbia Heights in DC called Bad Saint. I'm originally from Chicago, where I was raised in a very dynamic and large Filipino American community. But I have been in DC now for 26 years and was really excited when the opportunity presented itself. I was really excited to open a Filipino restaurant here in the District of Columbia.
So I'm Rita Cacas. I was born here in Washington, D.C. My father arrived in the Philippines in 1929. And for the past 30 years, I've been so interested in Filipino American history, specifically here in the Washington, D.C. area, because not much was written about the D.C. Filipinos. And so in 2009, I wrote this book, Filipinos in Washington, D.C. And it's over time, you know, I had interviewed a lot of DC Filipinos, the elders, and then when I retired from the federal government in 2014, I established a foundation that preserves the history of Filipinos here in Washington, D.C. It's called the Rita Cacas Foundation.
And Rita, so you've literally written the book about Filipinos in DC. And so I think that's such an important resource. So yeah, so I wanted to tell you that for us as Filipinos living in the district, it gives us pride to know that that our story is somewhere on the written page.
Oh, thanks, Ben. We also, in 2015, I established an archives at the University of Maryland that preserves the records like photographs and documents and like a lot of historic stuff that was left behind by Filipinos who, you know, they wanted to share their story too. So, and it's open to the public. It's open for research.
Great.
So, so I have a question for Genevieve. So Genevieve, I love your restaurant, the Bad Saint. And so I always tell my friends, look, I'm 64 years old. I've been eating Filipino food all my life. You know, why is it all of a sudden Filipino food is so popular and so, you know, here in DC especially. Genevieve, talk about how you chose DC as your place to have your restaurant.
Sure. Well, you know, I've been living in DC for a long time, and this is actually my second career working in restaurants. My first career was working in the nonprofit community in Washington. So at a certain point in my life, I just realized that, you know, I'm not just passing through the city. Like, I love the city, and whatever I choose to do, I really want to do it here in this community. And so after kind of leaving my nonprofit work and starting to work in the restaurant industry, and then really falling in love with restaurants and realizing that I wanted to open my own, I didn't want to go to a new place where I didn't know people and I didn't have like a social connection, you know. It made so much sense to start the restaurant here just because I'd been living here for so long and all of my relationships, friendships, and connections were here in Washington. In terms of sort of the blooming of Filipino food, I really think it's actually something that has not happened overnight and has happened in successive waves, especially depending on where you are in the country. I feel like growing up, there were always community places that my family loved going to, not just restaurants, but like, you know, Filipino grocery stores and places that were really like a hub of the community, you know, where people would run into each other and share news. One restaurant that I grew up going to and that I know is frequented over the years by lots of Filipino American artists and activists in Chicago was Isla, on the north side where I grew up. And so I feel like, you know, Filipino restaurants have in a lot of ways like been hiding in plain sight. And it just, for me, what it felt like really was that the opportunities that came our way to Bad Saint were really because of so many people that went before us that were trying to spread the word and evangelize about Filipino food, like Romy Darotan and Amy Bessa in New York, like first with Centralon in Soho, and then now continuing with Purple Yam, both in Brooklyn and in Manila. And just, you know, all these places across the country, both mom and pop restaurants and sort of like newer generation Filipino restaurants. I feel like it's just, you know, like a tide that lifts all boats, you know? So I think that it's really exciting just to see how popular it is becoming. But something that I often try to remember and that I try to remind and share with people is that, you know, food trends come and go, but our food is like, we're always going to love our food, you know, like it was always special to us. It will continue to be special to us. And of course, it's always nice to be recognized and appreciated both by our community and outside our community. But like, we know that we will all continue to love Filipino food no matter what the next food trend is.
It's not a trend for us.
Right, it's not a trend for us.
Right.
I will say, Genevieve, I think you're selling yourself short also. I mean, I think that especially here in the district, but also nationally, I mean, I think DC has a really big footprint in the terms of the evolution of Filipino food as kind of a national phenomenon. You know, I think your pedigree is right. I mean, all of those names that you've mentioned have really been part of, you know, those that have come before us, right? But then you've got folks like Nicole Ponseca in New York, and then shortly after, you know, she began to do things up there. You know, it moved down the Boston, Washington, D.C. corridor, and you and Patrice opened up your restaurants and made a big splash. And, you know, like getting awards and getting people in the door, just really were visible and, you know, just very recognizable ways that our cuisine was able to have a national impact. And so, you know, people felt it around the country. You know, all the places in California that have been there forever, you know, the places in Chicago, the newer places in other parts of the country. You know, I think, but I think you're right though. The rising tide has lifted all boats.
Mm-hmm. I do have a question for Rita that I've been wondering about, because I just think that your body of work is so interesting. I know that you had a career working at the National Archives and then through your foundation and then collaborating with the University of Maryland, like you've done so much for the community in terms of documenting the history of Filipinos and Filipino Americans in our area. And I was just wondering, where do you think your appreciation for history came from? Because I think that to the degree that you've taken it, it's not very typical. And I was just wondering if there was like something that really influenced you that kind of like planted that early seed that led to your interest in history?
You know, for me, it was because my dad was an older father. He married when he was 44 years old. His sister wrote to him after the war and said, it's time for you to get married at age 44. So he goes to the Philippines. He actually had an arranged marriage set up for him. And he ended up meeting it was not the woman he met my mom, who was 20 years younger than him. And so he brought her back here to the U.S. here in Maryland. Actually, we were raised in Oxon Hill, Maryland. And so, as we were growing up, my dad would always try to tell us about life about the Filipinos, you know, from the 30s and 40s. And it's like we were just little kids. And so finally, when I had the chance to interview him, he was already in his late 70s and 80s, and he started to have Alzheimer's. So he started to forget things, and he couldn't tell us the full stories anymore. So I was actually able to sit with him for like 4 straight hours one day. And I got, you know, most of his story. And then I realized, you know, he's talking about all these other Filipinos in the area. And that really, you know, turned a point for me, because I thought, you know, outside of their families, nobody knew these stories. And so it was that was really the moment that I cherished, being able to ask my dad to get the full story. So, and then it just opened up all these other opportunities to write about the Filipinos here. Ben, what for the DC government that you work for, how do you all celebrate Filipino American History Month?
That's a good question. So I will say that, you know, the Filipino American History Month, I guess it's all relative, I suppose, but, you know, I mean, it's still a relatively new concept, right? I mean, FAHMS, the Filipino American National Historical Society, started thinking about it in the 90s. You know, in DC, nationally, at least, the houses of the House of Representatives and the Senate didn't officially recognize it until 2009. And so my boss, actually, Mayor Bowser, before I started working for her, became what we think is the first mayor in DC to officially recognize Filipino American History Month.
Wow.
So in 2015, her first year in office, she you know, worked with the local community here. I was doing some work with the veterans, and so she actually brought me in. So the office that I now work at had contacted me at the time and said they wanted to do something for Filipino American History Month. And the next thing we know, I actually just found old flyers and old materials related to it. We had a conversation about the veterans back then, the Filipino World War II veterans. And so little did I know that I would end up working at this office that began that great tradition. But yeah, no, so I'm always a little wary about claiming the first, the title of the first, because as soon as you say, oh, we were the first, someone crawls out of the woodwork and says, well, actually, 20 years ago, we did it this way. But until someone lets us know otherwise, I believe that Mayor Muriel Bowser was the first mayor to celebrate Filipino American History Month. We do have a proclamation that the mayor has issued to recognize Filipino American History Month. It's been out. We've been putting it out on social media. We will probably do so again before the month ends. But yeah, no, so it's been exciting as the first Filipino to be the director of this office, to be here, you know, being able to recognize Filipino American History Month. We talked about FAHMS earlier, right? And FAHMS, at least for the last couple of years, has created a theme around which to celebrate Filipino American History Month. Last year it was women. The year before that, I think it focused on a particular date. But regardless, this year the theme is celebrating Filipino American activism. and it recognizes milestones, whether it's around student activists. This is the 50th year of the Third World Liberation Strike in California. There's World War II anniversaries that we're recognizing. The Watsonville race riots, I think, also have a milestone history this year. I think if you broaden the scope of what activism means in terms of wanting to create change for your community, I would make the argument that both of you actually are activists in your particular spaces. But maybe this question is for both of you, but maybe, what do you think about the theme of activism? And, do you think about it in terms of your life and what you're doing now? What do you think about being an activist?
Genevieve, you go.
Yeah, I'm really feeling this question, Ben. I think for me, being a small business owner, my activist sensibility never really left me. I think it was just more like I was having the opportunity to express it in a different way with a different position as a business owner. And for me, my history as a community activist and as someone who's worked at nonprofit organizations with a focus on social justice, I feel like there are so many skill sets and concerns that cross over into owning a small business in terms of how employees are treated, how the business interacts with our community and the greater world at large, and how we engage, especially in social times that, this moment socially, culturally is an incredibly rich and it's just like an incredibly rich moment in terms of activism, and people really truly being engaged in lots of ways that maybe they weren't before. And it's been really inspiring. And also, given that we interact with people in a certain kind of way, we have been looking at what we do as an opportunity to share with others messages about things that are really important to us. And so, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been trying to look for lots of different creative ways to communicate our values and our social concerns to our guests and supporters. Just because it feels like, we all have our role to play in highlighting various types of activism. And so I've just been really always trying to find new ways to do that.
Nice. Rita?
So for me, I guess I was kind of an activist from the 70s. I grew up, here in DC in the 70s, and my brother Sam Cacas, he was pretty active in a lot of the demonstrations. And I don't know if you know Juanita Tamayo Lott. She was here in the DC area, and then also John Malagrito. They ran around with my brother, and they used to demonstrate for immigrant rights back in the 70s. And I remember a couple of times my brother brought me with him, and I thought, this is pretty amazing. And the reason I bring it up is because it just kind of appalls, surprises me. We're still fighting for immigrant rights, 50 something years later. And, just to sort of, know that we had this history here in DC of activism is kind of neat. Let me just show you very quickly. I'm going to share a picture from my book that shows, can you see this page from my book? Do I have to shrink it down a little bit? There's my brother over here holding, there's my brother, there's Juanita, and somewhere in here, there's some other Filipinos, but anyway, that's kind of, my little bit of history that I was able to capture of our activism here in Washington. I also marched in the 1978 ERA march, the you know, for the Equal Rights Amendment. So I remember that my mom, like, you know, the suffragettes wore white, and so we had to wear something white. Plus, it was July in DC, and I said, "Mom, you've got to make me something white, a dress." So she made me this wraparound skirt, you know, so that I. And then actually, I was on the one of the front pages holding a banner because I was the only one person of color at the time, and there were a whole line of women. I've got it here someplace, but I'm not going to dig through. And so, you know, there I am on the front page of the Post.
I mean, that's the sort of value of DC as a place where history is made, right? I mean, on one hand, we have a very localized history. You know, you've documented, Rita, you know, the building where, you know, folks hung out in the 20s, you know, and have gotten that kind of made sure that that remains part of our history and it's documented as such. But also as the seat of, as the capital, you know, we get to be part of the national dialogue on something. So, you know, whether it's, you know, our own issues, Filipino issues or Filipino American issues, whatever that means, you know, there's stories about, you know, like Juanita, or there's stories about anti-Marcos protests in front of what is now the Philippine Chancery, right across the street from the new the Philippine Embassy, you know, or Filipinos, you know, at other marches, you know, over the years, you know, the Women's March, the, you know, the Pride marches over the years. So, you know, I think we get to be part of the national story. And also, if there's anything I've learned the last 2 years of my working for the local government, like it's a very small city, you know? And so everybody knows each other, and, you know, it has its own history that I think we're glad that you've been able to document, Rita.
Look, there I am.
Yep.
Brown person out front.
Nice.
These were in the Washington Post, 1978. Anyway.
Is there anything else we should say as we close up?
I'm good.
I don't think I have anything else. I just wanted to say thank you for getting all this organized and getting us together.
Yes, thank you, Ben.
Yeah, no, thank you all. I think this has been great. You know, I think it's such an important conversation to have. And I think I asked my mom if she knew that it was Filipino American History Month, because I've been reminded that not enough people know, not even Filipinos know. So it's important for us to make sure that that we're letting everybody know. So thanks for helping us tell that story.
Let's get the word out, and let's help everybody to go out and vote for next week.
Okay, well, thank you. Happy Filipino American History Month.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Genevieve.
Bye.